but let's make a start. Good morning, everyone. Hello, welcome. This is the Climate and Business Forum of IGF 2024, so welcome. I know you've all been at events just next door in the boardroom. We're going to start a little later than planned in here, but I want to make sure that as many as possible could get in here. Welcome, of course, too, if you're online, you're watching around the world. Remember, you can join the conversation as well. Just use the hashtag IGFAE. And so we're going to start today looking at some of the key issues of our time, but sustainability quite clearly. But what that means in a business context and how we might adapt and work together to solve some of those challenges. And I want to start, first of all, looking at collaboration is the title of this session, about whether companies need to rethink their approach to sustainability, and no longer can business operate in a silo, in isolation. Business needs to work together to solve some of these problems. And I'm delighted that with me, as you can see, Rajesh Garg, who's the Group CFO and lead on sustainability at the Landmark Group. So Rajesh, good to have you here. We've got sort of 15 minutes or so, so let's jump straight into it. And let's start with that issue of collaboration, because it's easy for people to talk about, isn't it? Of course, we should all work together to solve these huge challenges. Not so simple in practice. Talk to me, first of all, about what collaboration means to you when we talk particularly about sustainability.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I think I've been using this word coopetition instead of competition. And I think in the world of sustainability, it probably is even more important than in anything else, because simply said, you don't want to be the last man standing on a planet which is destroyed. So you can't, to your point, you can't operate in a silo. Even if you become extremely sustainable, if everything around you, the rest of the industry, the rest of the customers, the rest of your sourcing, supply chain, whatever, is unsustainable, then it won't go very far. So there is no choice. You have to work through and through with all your stakeholders. And I would say, so before I go, I think to help you understand what I mean by this is, and it can apply to any company. We've built or come up with a framework which is holistic, really 360 degrees across our entire value chain. And simplistically, it's got three parts: sustainable products, sustainable operations, and sustainable customer journeys. And that closes the loop. And when you start building in it, right from product design, material choices, processes, then you come towards transportation, logistics, warehousing, and we also have retail shops, how you retail your product, what you do, and then how the customer uses your product. If you think about it, everywhere you go, there are a whole bunch of stakeholders, whether it is companies or for producing your raw materials. So what kind of cotton, what kind of polyester, we have 10,000 plus suppliers who we are now working with. And we need to raise their game for them to become more ESG friendly and to be on a path of, So collaboration is all across.
Talk about that circular effect, and I wonder what has been the hardest part of that to fix. Because you make it sound very simple, but I imagine each one of those comes with its challenges. What has been the hardest part of that process?
Yeah. I think the first is, there's a lot of talk. The awareness is very low all across. And let's leave aside the customer awareness for a moment. Even the understanding of what your footprint is very weak. And we realized that fast, that changing glass bottles or plastic bottles in the office or just not having straws and all is not going to fix our problem. Our footprint is 89% is scope 3, which means either upstream, where the product is, the product design, the product, or downstream, what the customers do with the product after they use it. So unless we fix that, 11%, if I just fix my own internal operations, is not going to take me that far. But how we've done this is we've done a very reasonably accurate exercise of understanding the footprint of each product. So we have 40,000 product types. We've done the life cycle analysis of all of those. And it's very accurate. It's not precise, but it doesn't need to be precise. because it has given us so much insights of where is the footprint coming from, and hence attack the big footprint. So the challenges first was the understanding of your footprint was very complicated. There are no standard softwares available. We built it on our own, and we are very happy because that gives us so much insight. So that was the biggest challenge. Then obviously comes convincing your suppliers to migrate to a more sustainable way of operation or processes they use. I think there you come with creating, you have to influence them. There is a cost associated. You've got to find offsets. So the third part is what I call it is an expensive transition.
Yeah, and on that issue of cost, I think it's fair to say that for too long it has been financially lucrative to damage the planet or damage society. It has been too easy to be rewarded for doing bad things. There is a cost associated with sustainability, but do you think we are at the stage now where organizations understand that actually doing right can also mean doing well, and that at the bottom line, it is beneficial to be sustainable?
See, if you really love your company, you really love your brand, and you're a leader, I think you would have embarked on this journey. And you're seeing that all around in varying stages. But I always believe if you started, it's half there. So I think that's the good part.
But do you think the message has got through that actually it is damaging to not to do this?
It's at the top 5% of the companies. I don't think it's gotten there yet. And not only in the corporations, even in your customers. So we continuously evaluate. So 86% of Arab youth say they will not buy from a brand which is damaging the environment. So when you read such data, you get, as a sustainability lead, you become very excited. The problem is at the shopping till. People are saying, you know what, my one unsustainable jeans, which is $10 cheaper, is not going to kill the environment. I'm going to just take it. So what people are doing, but on the till or in the actions, is way behind what they're talking about. Good thing is it's changing very fast. The newer generation, we get daily examples of how our customers are talking about it. They want it. So I think it's how do you get ahead of that curve?
And that sort of touches on my next question, which is, who is driving this? Is this coming from the top, from leadership? Is it coming from employees? Coming from customers saying you need to act this way, else I'm not going to shop with you? And you've sort of part answered that, but I'm interested in who is driving this.
See, it's obviously it started from top down. We are not a listed company, but our owners are extremely cognizant of what they want to do the right thing. And when we shared the data on what is the impact of our company, and larger the company, larger the huge footprint, it shakes you, right? And then when we've shared the data with our business CEOs, I mean, the first sustainability workshop we had about 100 leaders from the company. Some of the CEOs didn't get up from their seats for 5, 10, 7 minutes after the first presentation ended, saying, oh my God, this is the impact I'm having on the shoes, on the furniture, on the clothes. And that has seen them all embark on this journey, which is fantastic. So the enthusiasm in the company, with people, is very high.
One would assume, I suppose, that the more that people do it, the cheaper it gets to do it. Look, the title of this session is about collaboration or competition, and I wonder therefore what collaboration looks like in practice, because it's easy for us all to talk the talk, isn't it? That of course we should work together to do this. How would you do that? How do you work with your rivals and say, hang on, we've got a problem as an industry, we need to tackle this together?
So I think you're absolutely right. It's not that easy. We are not there yet in taking all our, industry players, our competitors along, but we are getting there. We've taken, for example, a lot of steps all across I talked about without worrying about what others are doing or not doing. But one big thing we've done is we've actually just set up a textile recycling facility in Dubai, which is kind of not very common for a brand to do it. We've created take-back programs, taking products in, and then recycling, creating fiber, sent it back to Asia and back into new products. So it's just beginning. But we're inviting the whole retail business group, industry, The government has shown up. So we've got on 9 December, we are launching it, and we are getting very good, very enthusiastic participation from the UAE Circular Economy Council, various key kind of right up to the top cabinet ministers, and we're very happy to see that they are saying, you as an industry leader, tell us what does Dubai, or rather I would say all of UAE needs to do to now move in this journey.
So if we tie those two themes together, one about the cost of doing this and whether it is commercially and competitively advantageous, and also that idea of collaboration, where do you draw the line between collaboration and competition? Clearly, you're in this to be a successful organization. At what point do you say, okay, we can't collaborate on that because that's going to affect how competitive we are? Where do you make that judgment call?
I think it's like the ocean versus us protecting a drop. It's just too big of a problem to worry about. We will, if we are leading and we are way ahead, it's such a long journey. We don't worry about it. And we'd rather be happy if all of them came along so that we are all more sustainable brands. But of course, and then the product and whatever else was a reason to compete stays.
But there must be decisions whereby you say, yes, we could choose this option or this option. This one costs significantly more, but is better for the environment, or it is better for society. This one is cheaper. It means that we can make a better return, but it's a bit more detrimental. If your rival is choosing that option, it's difficult for you to choose that option.
So that's where you would want regulation to help. So if you look at Europe, they are definitely way ahead of the rest of the world in defining the amount of recycled materials that need to go in your products, defining what happens end of use. So I think some regulation to prime the pump, call it, will be needed. But in the end, it will be the customers who will decide. And we feel, we are believers that customers are watching, and that's the best test. And being leaders, you have to be ahead of what the customers want.
And neatly, to talk of regulation, it's so easy right now as well, isn't it, to throw around these terms about sustainability, the eco-washing, the green-washing, whatever you want to call it. And if consumers are at the stage where they're making decisions on the spur of the moment at a till, usually based on price, that eco-washing works, what role does regulation play in actually holding companies to account and saying, you can only make these claims if you are going to back them up properly with action?
Yeah, I think, if the regulators should play a role in making a level playing field. For example, sustainable financing. We are now 100%, more or less 100% of our entire financing is green and sustainability linked financing. We are the first, and we are now gone 100%. But if I tell you, and I'm not going to tell you the delta, the discount we get, frankly, it's meaningless. So that's where the regulators, and they should wake up, that if I am sustainably oriented, I'm not getting a discount, then hit the other guy with a premium.
And that's the thing, isn't it? It's actually the norm should be the doing the right thing, and the expensive option should be the most detrimental. Okay, so here we are, we're in 2024, and we're having these conversations. Spin us forward, not a huge amount of time, 2030 maybe. What does it look like? What does the sustainability discussion look like? What will we be talking about on this stage 6 years from now?
See, I'm a big believer that there is a Cambrian explosion in innovation that's starting to happen all across materials, energy, transportation. And I think that would have come mainstream by then. It would still not be there because it'll probably be another decade before a company like us could claim to be scope 1, 2, and 3 neutral. But I would think there will be a lot of, so we are already seeing a flurry of materials, like alternate materials made at zero impact to the environment, made from materials that are recycled or what have you. The cost of recycled PET is more than virgin PET. So I think you will start seeing that impact, the way the entire energy. So we've gone maxed out on whatever regulators allow us on renewable energy. So we are one of the largest users of renewable energy, but we are maxed out. Transportation, so all your shipping, Although 2030 is too early, I believe by 2040, the entire shipping industry will be green, meaning for the leading companies, green methanol.
And then if we look at what's happening in the world right now, and the theme of this event, of course, is limitless futures. But there's a lot going on in the world right now.
Yeah.
Particularly look at what's happening maybe. We have wars in the world. We have an incoming presidency in the United States that could change things somewhat. Does that change the equation? Or do you think that we're so far along this journey and the momentum is sufficient now to continue despite what are quite clearly some really big headwinds? If you just look at what President-elect Trump wants to do is drill, 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 or drill, baby, drill. Faced with those pressures coming the other direction, we've got enough momentum to sustain this?
I think so. These are momentary, small, and probably the fringe companies might make poorer decisions, but if you are a leading company with the right thought leadership and the right future, so like Landmark turned 50 this year, we're looking at the next 50. So I don't think a presidency of few years is going to change any of that. But I think the biggest change coming, which was in the room next door, is about AI, and I'm a very big believer that is going to be a very big help for us. So we are already using a lot of AI to try to help our operations become more sustainable.
The efficiency element of AI is breathtaking,
Yeah.
isn't it? Rajesh, thank you so much. What a great way to start our discussions on this stage today for this Climate and Business Forum. Really grateful for your time. Thank you. Ladies and gents,
Thank
Rajesh
you very much.
Gargade, Group CFO and Lead on Sustainability at Landmark Group.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. We're going to have a quick break, and then we'll be right back with the next session. Thank you.
And I'm Anisha Jain. Well, the topic that we're discussing at hand is greening the bottom line, financial strategies for sustainable future. It's no longer a debate whether we need to greenline the bottom line or not, but of course, this is something which is a pertinent point because the practicality of it has been really difficult. So today we'll try and decode how do you find practical solutions to greenlining the bottom line. To join me in that conversation, I have Harish K. Ahuja, the Head of Sustainability, Carbon and Power Markets Listing, SSE, National Stock Exchange India. We have Dharnesh Gordon, the former CEO at Godrej Consumer and Nestle UAE, and Samira Fernandez, Chief Sustainability Officer and Board Member, Century Financial. If I can just invite you on the stage, everyone.
Traffic is good. There's no choice.
Yeah. So where are you living?
So I
We'll wait for Dharnesh also to join us.
Okay,
Why
so
don't
you
we
live-
start the conversation?
Should we?
Well, yes, the questions which remain the most pertinent and something that everybody wants answers to is the practicality of it. Help me decode that. With respect to the kind of setup that we have at our hand, is it practically even possible to green the bottom line? Why don't you start for us, Harish?
I think it's a very pertinent question. The way I like to start is you have to see the equation, Only if the corporates are doing well, then they do the good. Doing well means they are performing in terms of profitability, And I would say when the doing well is equal to doing good means they are doing consistently well. If you talk about a young SMEs or a young startup to from day one start focusing upon the practicability of applying the ESG practices or applying the sustainable practices, they may not prefer it. But some reasonably mature companies or companies which have been to the business, they somehow demystified the business model from their consumer And from the profitability, I think they will do better in terms of adopting the sustainable practices. And this is very much possible, and many companies are doing it. In fact, many companies are turning around their balance in such a way that their OPEX is becoming CAPEX. I'll talk more about that. But I think most of the good companies which have decoded the profitability mantra are already doing it. And it's very much practically possible. So this is my definitive answer. It's doing it. I'll share more specific in the later on. Yeah.
Sure, but let me toss it to the, former corporate on the panel here, Dharnesh. Is it really practically possible for corporates to go ahead and, green the bottom line and not, letting go of the profitability in that sense?
So my answer is yes. And maybe I'll just step back and talk about absolute practicality. And, if I reflect on me growing up in a city called Durban in South Africa, and the number of avocado trees, sugar cane, we had all of these things, and we took care of it, right? So always think it all has to start from people, community, then corporate. Corporate has a role in education, productivity improvements, embracing and implementing technology. So I always think and in my own experience, and especially Nestle's focus on what is called purpose, was always about community engagement, because you cannot do anything without community engagement. So somehow I feel that we always come from a different lens, which is let's finance, let's understand the bottom line. And the bottom line will happen if we allow communities to uplift themselves, which is improvement agricultural productivity, improving an understanding of how do I protect my neighborhood, my community, my backyard. So the answer is absolutely yes. I really believe it's possible. And I don't want to talk about the 300 years of negative history in a way, when with colonialism, the extraction of the real wealth of the continent was taken out with total disregard for what was left behind. But I see the difference now myself. I've seen it implemented by corporates who believe in it. But it's a long game. It's not, this quarter's results are looking not so good. The analyst will say this. And this is this mindset of analyst view. And if you don't mind, I'll just reflect on something. Probably one of the most interesting roles I've ever had was to be a CEO of a Nestle listed entity. Now, Nestle doesn't have many external listed entities, so Nestle Nigeria listed on the Nigeria Stock Exchange. And it was very interesting. I had a visit from a globally renowned investor, one of the most famous names in the industry, and he came to my office and he says, you don't track the share price. I said, no. If my job is to manage the share price, then I'm not doing justice to the business. So I think that mindset is something that it's very difficult, I understand. The other thing is how you measure. Yesterday's conversation, we talked about measurement metrics, right? It's if I believe that, I need a EBITDA of 17%, which is my global average, when I'm 80% in developed markets, and I'm using the same metrics to measure profitability in this market, which then hinders me from implementing new manufacturing technology, which hinders me from investing in communities. So because every cent we can squeeze, and then eventually what happens, you reduce marketing spend as well. And then you say, oh, the business is not performing. So.
Yeah, but just brings me to the next question. Is there something called a first mover disadvantage here for industries to kind of get into it? And is the only way to collaborate together as a group across the industry? Is that the only way? Because otherwise, if let's say Nestle makes a move and the others don't, your profitability will suffer and those analysts will ask you those questions while others will be doing better. So is collaboration the only way forward for this?
So let's talk about plastic waste, right? And one of the things is no single company can do it by themselves. It has to be an industry based. So when you talk about plastic waste, and I know we talk about Africa, but I give you an example about Indonesia. It is such a problem. The world's plastic is landing on the coastlines of Indonesia. But if you want a plastic action committee, it can't be a singular organization. So getting like-minded people together to engage with government, to engage with NGOs, but also to engage with a head office that sits somewhere else in the world, become the most powerful. Because then as a overall industry or industrialists getting together, you can go talk to communities. Because otherwise it's seen as another brand tactic. And you want to avoid this thing of, I'm doing it because it looked cool for my brand. And that's not why you do it.
Fair enough, but one of the major problems has been, of course, the financing part of a lot of these projects as well. So let me get Samira into the conversation as well. The bulk of the financing so far, and we need a lot of financing for this, is being done by the public sector itself, and the private sector is not really participating. At least that's what the naysayers are saying. Would you concur with that? And secondly, what should we do to make sure that the private sector also lives up to the expectation to that extent?
So I think it's really important that we redefine the narrative of what these green financing options are all about. We talk about greening the bottom line, but are we really doing so is the question. And I think if I may be a bit candid here, to talk about clarity from the government, clarity when you are amidst many regulators, how can we look at standardization? How can we look at advocacy? Bringing in the opinions, the challenges of those in the industry to the table, and then having the government play a role in redefining the policies. And I think once it is done, then it is very imperative for the companies and the corporate sector to establish a clear mandate to not just integrate ESG into their offerings, but in every part of the system. We talk about the supply chain, sustainable alignment, we talk about mandating a reduction of carbon emissions. And this shouldn't just be, a roadmap or a vision of the government. And that's where, as you rightly said, the role of partnerships. How can we matchmake? How can we bridge the gap between the private and public sector? And once we get that, I think that is the answer to greening this bottom line.
Yeah, that indeed is the answer. Looks easy, but very difficult to do that. So let me just ask you that, Harish. How would you rate the success of the green financing so far? Do you think it's more glass half full, or is it more glass half empty?
No, I like to answer with glass more full, in fact. I will not say half full, more full. And let's share the data here. In fact, let's talk the numbers here. In fact, that will give perspective. Being a realistic, being a marketer from stock market, let's see the number of India per se. So let's say globally. Globally, we are talking about $2.7 trillion year on year till 2050 for net zero. For Europe, we need around $500 billion year on year, again for till 2050. Asia, $500 billion year on year till 2050. And what we are offering COP29, only $300 billion. And that too after 2035. Let's come to India now. India needs around $40 billion year on year till 2030 only for two sectors, transport and power generation, And at this stage, it's good story now coming down, So out of 40 billion, the enormity of task is in last 3 years, average we had done roughly $4 to $5 billion. Now from $4 $5 billion to going to 30 billion is a 10x, 6x cost, But now I'm saying why I'm saying that glass is full. Because if you see the number of last year, so far this financial year, we have raised around roughly $10 billion in equity. And out of that $10 billion, $3.7 billion has been raised by the green companies, solar companies, electric vehicle companies, or companies having some kind of feet into the green hydrogen. $3.7 billion out of $10 billion from public market, 37% coming from the public market, from me and your pocket. It's a good transition. And the second is in debt sector also. In debt, we are around $67 billion. Out of $67 billion, $12 billion has gone to the companies which are to green causes. Again, 17 to 18%. So cumulative, if you see, we are contributing 22% of the capital formation public market going to green causes. There's no shortage of money. And that I'm talking only of India. Now the second thing is what she said. I think most of the countries don't have green taxonomy in place, or they're just copying the Europe, or they're copying the US, because around 93% of green finance is being raised by these two continents. One is Europe, one is America. But in terms of other developing countries, or even China, I take in a developing country, we are raising only 7%. So I think green financing is yet to develop, and very happy to share that India is definitely taking a baby step, but this has become a very giant step in a few years. Now, last but not the least, I think I'd like to answer his question. I think agreeing the bottom line is a very strategic call one company has to take. And I'll give a very live example, and this example can be copied by many founders sitting over here, a company officials sitting over here. Let's acknowledge three things which are kind of permanent now because of the geopolitical risk, because of this isolation of the trade politics. I think inflation is not going to go away. Your commodity prices are going to go high. So if you see P&L, if you have been CEO, sir, if you see your P&L, interest cost is going to high. Your gross margin is going to shrink. Now, where exactly you can bring the bottom line? You have to see your certain costs which can be transformed into certain other buckets. So let's say electricity cost. Every steel company, cement company, or for that matter, plastic company has around 10 to 12% of electricity cost. Now they are buying the power from fossil fuel or from the coal or thermal. Can you buy it from solar or can you buy it from wind power? And this OPEX in your P&L, if you buy from your own power plant or you put up your own captive, this OPEX become your CAPEX. Now this CAPEX can be financed from the public market from us. We give the green equity, or you can raise the green debt, green bond. Again, we come to that. And last but not the least, when a company which is not under the cap and trade scheme, when they voluntarily shift their OPEX into CAPEX, which is on for green infrastructure, they get carbon credits. They can sell the carbon credits. So three instruments use just one stroke. Green debt, green equity, and carbon credit project financing. So I think if you use it strategically, becoming green is not only imminent, but at the same time is a very useful choice. So this is my example. Yeah.
Yeah, because if you go by the statistics, energy efficiency over the next few years is expected to save as much as $437 billion and can increase the revenue by 10%, at least by some studies. So definitely there is that merit in doing that. But Dharnesh, yes, go ahead. Yeah.
So, just taking a cue from the discussion is if you just think about logistics cost across. I used to be fascinated when it was cheaper for a market, I've got to be careful how I phrase, a market in West Africa to import from Europe than to get from your neighbor, or at least one country away. When I was responsible and we should travel to all the markets in West Africa when I was living in Nigeria at the time, we eventually realized it was cheaper to hire a private jet and buy so many hours in a month. I could take the team around from Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, etc., rather than fly commercial, because it takes you 4 days. And actually the cost. So when you talk about a single truckway, so I think this investment in infrastructure, I know, for example, DP World is doing an incredible investments. It's just mind-blowing for me. They've taken a long view, and I think that will be of great benefit. Now I go to something else, and I'm going to try and be very broad industry-based. If you take how much of spend of turnover is spent on marketing spend, right? On average, a CPG company across, let's say, 40 billion CPG, I'll be very broad because it depends on categories, but $40 billion CPG annual turnover on the continent. On average, 8 to 9% is spent on marketing investment, that is direct consumer communication. So the money is there. Then you talk about trade spend, distributor, incentives, blah, blah, blah. Eventually 14, 15, 18% of your is. So there's money there. It's the willingness to spend, because the challenge I used to have is every time I hire a new brand manager, they want a new campaign. Why? Why you want to change the color of the label? You understand my point? So sometimes we're not understanding. So does it resonate with somebody who lives in a community? If we really understand that, does having greenery around me, does avoiding landslides, does avoiding floods resonate with me, then I'm prepared to buy products from companies who taking it responsibly.
But the problem is there. People realize it, but they're not working towards it. And I think that's the gap. However, the other thing I wanted to check with you, of course, is about the corporate responsibility. Samira talked about how there's a bit of an ambiguity when it comes to the common market language around it. The governments haven't been very specific around it. But the other problem is lack of demand commitments, right? I was just talking to a corporate who's managed to develop this green steel, but because it's more expensive than the normal steel, there are no buyers for it. Will having demand commitments also serve that purpose? What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, if I reflect on packaging changes alone that happened many years ago, right? Or I just talk about the supermarket shopping bag. And I remember, like 18, 20 years ago in South Africa, they started charging you for the plastic bag. In the beginning, everyone was freaking out. Everybody was freaking out.
Same here in India.
But today it is just so, people are just used to it and they actually embrace it. So sometimes you've got to just bang it. I mean, the education as a role, and everybody, I need to engage with you, kumbaya, but eventually sometimes it's just, that's industry's role. Industry's role is to engage with government and say, look, we need this done. We agree it's going to have a cost today, but the benefits are Y. So therefore, we need enforcing of legislation on some of these things. So you've seen that moves happen more in the more developed markets in Africa, for example, and you've seen the positive of that coming through.
No, just that brings me to the next question that I had for Samira around, the policy action around it, because all the governments are talking about it. We kind of look at every forum and they're talking about the green energy targets that they have, but there's this lack of clarity in the absolute number sense. Till the time you don't know what the destination is in the absolute sense, how do you define a path to it? Do you think that is something also which is missing from the government and the policy making part of things?
I think at the end of the day, it's all about our purpose, be it personal or professional. So I think, if we take a stance on how is it that we would like to redefine the bottom line. Let's take an example of IKEA. More than 75% of their transition has happened recently to look at sustainable wood, for example, or sustainable solutions. Let's look at Patagonia, completely into recyclables. Has anyone asked them to do so? Never. What about Ørsted? They've moved from fossil fuels to investing high in renewable energy, be it solar winds and, the panels, wind energies and all that. So I think, rather than leaving it to the external, the externals, I think it's time all of us in the room be solutionaries. How in our own way can we contribute towards sustainability, be it in our business, be it in our professional and personal lives? And I think, going back to financing options, we have the green tokenizations. We have the green securitization at the moment, which is coming out. You have the green bonds. You have a lot of models which are coming into place, all centered around credibility. Yes, I think it is time when the private sector gets together to help in establishing these frameworks. For example, Dubai Chambers recently released the ESG label. And I think this is a big transition when you spoke about CSR to ESG to ensure there is complete compliance in every business operation right from the start to the end. And this comprises not just large companies alone, right from your MSMEs to your startups. And just imagine a day when even before you commence operations, you integrate sustainability in all your operations and your financing mechanisms. So I think it is a reality check that we need to put in place to see how is it that businesses operate. And rather than getting clarity from the out, how can we bring in clarity, showcase that to the rest of the world, be pioneers in what we do, lead by example, and then set the new trend.
For example, but Harish, you want to add something?
Yeah, I think I'd like to compliment Samira. She made a very important point. But in terms of Indian policy maker, regulator, I think we are doing a decent job. I think the world can look towards us here, in fact, because I think when we decided in COP25 that we'll be net zero by 2070, we have a very clear target in terms of NDC, in terms of our power generation from renewable. And you'll be happy to note that as on today, 40% of our power generation coming from renewables, and we are target to achieve around 50% by 2030. And if we add small hydro, we already achieve the target. So my submissions are, India in terms of the policy, in terms of the regulation, the rule book is pitch perfect, which everybody can copy it. I'd like to give some examples, then we'll come to the basic questions around. First and foremost, we have got production linking scheme for advanced battery cell. We have got production linking scheme for fab to module for solar plant. We have got green transmission line investment in place. In fact, anybody who set up the solar plant across India, they can just connect, plug and play with the green transmission line. We have in place the very much green credit, concept wherein individuals like you and me can save the planet by saving the carbon dioxide, and then we can earn the carbon credits and go and sell in the exchanges. So I think there's a perfect recipe of everything in India. Now coming back to what Samira is talking about, I like this point. In fact, I think most of the time people are going to sustainable practices, either greening the bottom line or meeting some regulatory directives. So it's more like a top-down approach where regulatory policymakers are pushing them, like buy green steel, something like that, or be conscious towards GHG emissions, or for that matter, your water waste. So it's a top-down approach, or investors are pushing us, like BlackRock or ESG conscious investors are pushing us to go for green. Or third is customer demanding it. But I think this top to bottom and bottoms out, bottoms to top approach may fail. But inners to out, what she talked about, that is inner consciousness, that being a responsible citizen, we have got a responsibility to save this nation, save the continent, globe as a whole. I think if this consciousness of a corporate guy or a founder of individual emanate from inside, I think, then I think greening the bottom line will become automatic.
Yeah, because a lot of people right now are greenwashing the bottom line and not really greening the bottom line. And that's the difference, because they are forced to do it in one way or the other. But, just Harish, add to that point, because how are financial institutions making sure that all the companies that they're investing in are being very serious about sustainability? And I'm not only talking about the green projects for which you get the green financing. Across all lending portfolio, how are they ensuring that? Because you're donned multiple hats, right? From being a bureaucrat to an investor to, of course, a corporate now. How do you think they can go about that, all the financial institutions, to make sure all the people that they're lending to are sustainably conscious entities?
I think it's a very good balancing art. As a financial institution, we understand that multiple companies would not have the priority of greening the bottom line, but making the day-to-day life sustainable. That's why I said doing well is very important to get doing good. Doing well means you are profitable. Now you are adding surplus profits towards making environment sustainable.
You're saying do well first and then do good.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a balancing act. I think I would not push a startup which is just trying to fix this revenue model, or a technology company just innovating the product to be a green company day one. I think this balancing act is done by every investor, every financial institutions. So we need to be very clear in terms of which company should be pushed for greening the bottom line, which company should be asked to innovate for the green side. This balancing, I think over a period we understand this. So let me give an example. At this stage, National Stock Exchange, or for that matter, Stock Exchange in India, are pushing the municipal corporation of India, right? So municipal corporation is the third layer of governance. There's the federal government, there's the state government, and the municipalities. In US, it is a $4 trillion market. In US, municipality has raised $4 trillion cumulative. Indian total market cap is around $5.1 trillion. And US alone municipalities, and India, I'm very unhappy to share that only 12 to 15 municipalities have raised less than $100 million. Now, if we ask them to green your bottom line first, is not right. We should first tell them which are the projects you can go for taking the refund. So I think this is a very special criteria. But having said so, there are many companies which need to go to the green side, like steel company, cement company, petrochemical company. To meet the NDC target, they need to think, because they're mature companies, they're making the profits. How can they put their money in the right side of the law in terms of greening the bottom line? So that way we are trying to balance it, And this challenge is everyday challenge, I think, short term versus long term, what he spoke about. And I think over a period we are learning the tightrope.
That brings me to the next question. This age-old fight, when you talked about nascent versus mature, Dharnesh, the age-old fight has been between emerging countries versus developed countries. How only so-called developed have that kind of on the shoulders to make sure that this is done. And emerging countries always keep talking about that. We need to first kind of come up to the curve, and then perhaps we can talk about all of this. Do you think it's time now that the emerging countries also need to actively participate? Of course, he was talking about how India is doing its bit. But other than that, also not hide or shy away from saying, in the sense, shy behind the fact that they're still kind of working towards the development, and take an active call around it.
Yeah, in my own engagements with a lot of government and businesses across West, East, and Southern Africa in particular, it's very interesting discussion. But we're always doing this, right? Number one. Number two, does my audience or my electorate want it in the first place? Mm-hmm. Which is very interesting. So my usual discussion with them is, the consumer didn't ask for good quality, but companies who implemented good quality practices in their products took market share, gain superiority in the market. Competitive differentiation, if I go, the last 100 years history of CPG companies is always the better my quality, the better my packaging, the better my efficiencies. So I invest in technology that gave me a superiority in the market, so I know there's certain brands that you will always feel safe to consume, right? It's an education process also. So now imagine, so that's now an entry point. So everybody has good quality. What's next? If it's safe, if it's nutritious, and it has the right ESG practices, now I'm getting to the holy grail of what a great product should be. So I think it is this combination. Nothing can happen on its own. No company, no government. It has to happen together. As long as companies know, whether you're a Swiss-based company or a Mumbai-based company, when you're operating in a market, you belong to that market. You have a responsibility to that community. And I think when you get that sense that you see other companies where they invest 2% of turnover in ESG efforts in this country, but in another country that they operate, they're already zero. So it's either it's a philosophy, it's a business practice, or it's not. It's like, I can't have great quality practices on one side, but I have the same brand in another market and I have lousy quality practices. So something doesn't work. So the DNA of that organization. So I think more and more consumers and shoppers will start questioning the DNA of an organization. And IKEA is a great example.
Yeah.
And by the way, they become the most accessible price points. So they are touching the touch points of it. It's an amazing business. And it's very interesting. It's like the Apple Watch. The lowest level of income earner to the most highest level will have Apple Watch. IKEA, you'll be surprised how many super rich people go shop at IKEA. So it just shows that it's a great example of what is possible. And it becomes, now what happens is, somebody wants to compete with IKEA. They know these are the benchmarks. I can't do only half. I can't have lousy quality and cheaper pricing, but I don't touch the... So I think the more companies show what's possible, you need a few examples. Like in life, you need a few good leaders to show the way, right? So you need organizations to show the way. I think organizations have more power than governments. That's my personal take on it.
I think that makes for a very interesting topic. But just I'll hand it over to Samira for any closing comments that you have in terms of which are the new emerging kind of financing tools which are available. Because if I go by the data that has been provided to me, it does seem like that adaptive financing still continues to be a bit underfunded. What do you think more can be done to make sure that there's enough financing available? I know we talked about that there's enough money, but it still seems to be not getting channeled into the right places.
So I think it all boils down, when we talk about adaptive financing, it all boils down to the unbiased investor. What are they looking at in terms of investors and the investment opportunities? And at the end of the day, what is the bottom line amounting to? And for that, we need to retrospect back and ask ourselves one question: what are our priorities? Are we really trying to balance sustainability-led solutions, or are we looking at economic viability? And once we have a clear vision of what our struggling priorities are, it clearly redefines what approach we are going to take in terms of adaptive financing. There are a lot of tools and solutions out there in the market. So much so you have, the angel investor networks, you have like the AVPN, which is a group of investors that we're also part on. And our conscious efforts to look at financing such projects leaves us with one question, which is the vetting process. All these projects look absolutely sincere, credible. But the point is, when we go down deep into evaluating these projects, that is where, it sends out a big world of questions where we do not have the right answers. And I think that is something that I would like to leave as a takeaway for a call to action for all of us. We have sustainable projects and initiatives. We have the funding, global funding from around the world. But the question is, how good is the vetting process to ensure the credibility? And I think that is what the world needs at the moment, to see between the haves and the have-nots, the opportunities that align the bigger interest goals, and see how can we make a difference when we stay true right from the purpose to the implementation, to the execution, and the end result.
Yeah, no, I think that's the key takeaway, because all of you three have talked about the same point in different languages, that it needs to be not top to bottom or bottom to up. It needs to be inside, in to out. It needs to be something where you have to lead by example and not wait for the governments and others to take action. And of course, it's about maintaining those ethos and brand value which stays true across all spectrum, and make sure that you're just providing the best quality that you can do, and then lead by example, as you said. With that, I'll wrap up this conversation. Thanks all of you for making time and being with us here at ICF 2024.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ari.
Thank you. Thank you.
Everyone, and thank you so much for joining us at day 2 at India Global Forum. My name is Mayban Khadra. I'm a senior business anchor at CNBC, and it's my pleasure to be joined here with amazing speakers. We're going to discuss a very interesting, timely topic, which is the transition to net zero. Please have a seat. And I would like to welcome our speakers. And before I do that, I would just like to do a quick intro about why this panel is such an important one. So, of course, the word is making the transition toward net zero by 2050, but this transition will require many steps, whether it's in the mobility sector, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's the energy sector. They all have to go hand in hand to achieve net zero by 2050. Today in our panel, we're going to be talking about the strategies, the policies, innovation and technology, and what each of these what role will each of these play in making this transition to net zero by 2050. And I'm really happy that we are joined here today by our speakers. I would like to introduce Mr. Hamad Rahman, Head of Asia Pacific Traditional Infrastructure at Mubadala Investment Company. I would like also to introduce Fazil Abdul Rahman, Group VP and Head of Sustainability and Climate Change at TAQA. And joining us virtually is Amit Prathi, Director General at CDRI. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I would like to start with you, Fazil. And when we talk about green initiatives, and especially when it comes to green energy grids, to what extent do you think that we have positive experience with these? And to what extent do you think that the lessons learned at this sector are positive enough that we can actually adopt them at a larger scale?
Thank you. First of all, good to be back again this year. I was telling Hamad last year, the crowd for climate just before COP28 was much more. But it seems there's much more noise around AI, and even the climate panels are more about yeah. But coming to the question, I like the fact that you're focusing on grids, because I feel always grids has been, so underplayed in terms of, let's say, the narrative or important when it comes to energy transition. Everyone has been focusing, and still to a great extent focusing just on renewables. But unless you have a grids to connect them to the customers, it's all of no use, right? And in fact, statistically, there is, I think 20% of the global capacity, if I'm not mistaken, is still laid out there, not connected just because you don't have the grids, right? So clearly grids is very important, not to be underplayed. And just to copy the classic saying, there's no transition without transmission. But what should be done in grids? Clearly, we are short on the infrastructure globally. Our existing infrastructure needs to be, let's say, refurbished. And then, of course, you have to connect even more infrastructure, and we are looking at 2 to 3 times of our current lines, which you have to get by 2050, right? Which is, if you take a statistics like how much you have to cover, like just putting the wires across the globe, it's a massive number. So within grids, where we see as an interest and where I think personally, which will be very important, is interconnectors. Because what interconnector does is it optimizes the systems. Because each and every region, countries are having, let's say, either less capacity, or some of them have a lot of spare capacity, and some of them having issues of variabilities, right? So when you're connecting, let's say, each countries or regions or big entities, you can actually optimize the system. I mean, classic example which we have been into is we are connecting at NOx onshore and offshore facilities to the grid. So the idea is, instead of them producing electricity or water of their own, we connect them to the nuclear and solar. A long shot which we announced last year, and the project is still going, is our investment in LexLinks. The idea is we have 15 gigawatt of renewables in Morocco, and we connect them to the UK. Long shot, but we feel that is the future, and that's the way to go ahead. In fact, in last global forum, I was on panel with one of the Indian government representatives. So we picked up the discussion how we could have a UAE-India corridor, which was exciting. So that is one interconnection. Second, of course, we cannot never overlook batteries. It's always there. The cost of batteries are coming down. So, I mean, we still prefer at utility scale the batteries, the cost to come down. So that is definitely an eye to watch for. And even in the region, let's say in Abu Dhabi, we have already, through the system planner, has already sent out the bids for large-scale battery projects. I mean, we are talking about big numbers now. And last but not the least is digitalization. I think the grids needs to be much more smart, whether it is in terms of, let's say, rectifying the grids, knowing the grids better, serving the customers better, planning the systems better. I think digital plays a key role on the grids. So yeah, interconnectors, batteries, and digitalization for me are 3 main things within the green grids perspective.
They are, and each of them come with their own set of challenges. I will come to this in a minute, but before I do that, I would like to go to Amit. And Amit, I want to ask you a question that globally it's being asked. It's maybe the $1 million question. Are we doing enough? I mean, when you look at governments globally, are they doing enough to achieve net zero by 2050? And to what extent do you think that there's some sort of divergence between what we're seeing in developed countries and what we're seeing in developing countries?
Thank you so much for having me, first of all, and my apologies that I could not be there in person. I hope you can hear me properly.
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay, great. So, I'm really coming from a perspective of something called resilience. When you're talking about grids, are we thinking about our grids to be resilient for the changes that we're going to see in the future? That's really the perspective that I come from. I lead an organization called the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. It is an international organization headquartered in Delhi. And what we are really trying to focus on is, when you look at the amount of impact in our energy sectors because of climate change, because of disaster, and given that there is still such a large need to invest in net zero infrastructure that is, yet to be built. Just a broad number, the amount of infrastructure we'll build in the next 20 years is what we built over the last 100 years. So what we are trying to say is, how do you do that in a way where in the future, understood your changing risk profiles? Your wind speeds are changing because cyclonic patterns are changing. You've got precipitation patterns that are changing that is causing flooding. So when we think about our energy infrastructure, how is it being built in a way where extreme heat is understood, where future risk from precipitation is understood, changing wind profile. So for us, really, the discussion starts to be about the resilience of our infrastructure systems. And within that context, to answer your questions, are the countries doing enough? I won't get into what the developed versus developing countries are doing for achieving their targets. From a resilience point of view, I would say a lot of them are still learning how do you start to address the risk of future climate change in your investment decisions for infrastructure today. Um, we're doing a fair amount of work in that space. We're trying to bring out data in the public domain that talks about physical risk. We built a model last year that literally looks at risk to infrastructure sector from 6 hazards. We're deepening that this year to bring extreme heat, which we never really had in the model in the first place, as a risk. We're trying to come up with works to understand where do you, like, how do you look at your BFS systems? So, for example, along the coast of Odisha in India, cyclonic patterns are changing. And how is that going to affect the energy system? How is that going to affect your grid in the future? And where do you need to put in investment today to enhance it? So let me just stop there because I think the question is slightly different than where I've taken this to, but I'll come back to it again if you need.
Thank you so much, Amit. I'm going to come back to you with a couple of things that you just mentioned, but I'm going to stay within the topic around what we're seeing globally between different regions. So, Hamad, when you look at Asia Pacific, and from your experience there, which markets do you think they're doing a great job when it comes to integrating climate change policy with infrastructure planning and construction? And what kind of lessons can other regions learn from their experience, from these positive stories, if any?
Firstly, I'm truly grateful to be here, to be part of this forum, and be participating along so many distinguished leaders. If I had to name one country that has set extremely ambitious renewable targets, but at the same time is taking very concrete action to be able to achieve those renewable targets, I think that country would have to be India. Starting with, I think most of us would know this, as you know, India has set an extremely ambitious target of having 500 gigawatts of renewable capacity by 2030. And I think when that target was set, I think it was back in 2021, everybody thought it was more of a political statement than reality. But now that you look at the progress that India has made over the last 5 years, I think in 2019, there was maybe roughly 80 gigawatts of renewable capacity. 5 years later, it's 200 gigawatts plus. So more than double, the amount of renewable capacity has been doubled. So it's a truly incredible accomplishment, and that 500 gigawatt goal is looking more and more likely. But I think the way the Indian government has thought is very interesting. They've realized that to achieve such a transformative scale of investment, they are going to need, on a very massive scale, lots of private international capital. And so you need to attract a lot of international capital, but also at a reasonable return expectation. Because if international investors come in and are asking for extremely high rates of return, you're never going to be able to scale up those investments. And that's exactly what the Indian government, I think, has been able to achieve by creating a truly robust regulatory environment. And I'll just give you a few examples. The government is supporting international investors with land and grid connectivity. They have offered long-term power purchase agreements, 15 to 20-year plus power purchase agreements. The regulator, SECI, is playing a key role. So one of the key concerns we had when we were starting to look at India was that payments from off-takers would sometimes come very late, sometimes 150 days, 200 days. So the regulator, SECI, has come in and has sort of taken away that risk by sort of being there as a supporter of last resort. Finally, the government has introduced a proper framework for corporate PPAs. So now, when you're trying to sign a power purchase agreement, you don't necessarily need to go to a government off-taker. Now there's a proper framework available where you can actually sign long-term agreements with corporations. And you see a lot of gigawatts of renewables being added. One other country that I'd like to mention that I'm actually very excited about is Singapore. And Singapore, by the way, as most of you might know, today is not really, its share of renewables is quite small. It's primarily gas power generation. But now Singapore has ambitions to install a lot of data centers driven by AI. That's the more interesting topic being discussed in the next hall. But Singapore is one of the ideal locations to put up data centers. Data centers are going to require a tremendous amount of power, which Singapore wants to be powered by green power. And so this shows the innovation that they're bringing in that they are basically installing large amounts of renewable power generation, not in Singapore, where there's a challenge with space, but in Indonesia and Malaysia. And then they're laying down undersea cables to bring in renewable power from their neighboring countries. Furthermore, Singapore has a lot of gas power, and they're one of the innovators in bringing in hydrogen. So they're starting to co-fire their gas-powered plants through hydrogen, so they can actually greenify their current gas-powered plants. So I think India and Singapore, I think, are sort of prime examples that we should try to emulate.
So you mentioned hydrogen, and Fazil, we hear all these about green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, gas as a transition fuel. When you look at renewables overall and the different sources of green energy, which ones are you most excited about, and which ones, in your opinion, are going to be a great contributor to achieving net zero by 2050?
Oh, Siddhi, there is no, it's a very tough question because it's very tough to pick, one single answer because a lot depends on the markets where you're in, because regulations, the off-takers, size of the projects all plays a part in it, right? But if I just quickly skim through some of those, right? I mean, green hydrogen overall has a big prospect. I mean, there's no question about it, right? But let's say compared to 2 years back and now, did we really achieve that momentum? My answer would be not really. There are a lot of barriers around it. Let's say like when Mubadala goes to any market, what he checks, I think that barriers are still there. One is we need a big off-taker for green hydrogen, which still is not happening, although there are good signs of pilots and discussions around that. I think second and foremost is we are looking at an infrastructure which is not, let's say, tuned for hydrogen yet, right? They're not designed for hydrogen intake, outlet, transmission, and so forth. I think talking about transportation, the geopolitics also comes into play. So hydrogen is still a wait and watch, but having said that, all know down the line it is very critical towards a net zero transition. I think the question is when you're going to see a break-even role. Many were expecting, let's say, 2025 in terms of big projects or so, but I see that happening further down the line. So that's the state on hydrogen. Carbon capture is definitely important because the question is, there are a lot of demand is coming up, whether it is in terms of the developing world. AI is a big demand on itself. So can we have renewables to meet all of them unless the technology cost of storage is another
I think carbon capture is extremely important for the region in particular, because they depend more
exactly,
on
because
fuel.
there's a lot of dependency on gas. But the good thing is a lot of gas new projects which is being commissioned here in the region, whether it is UAE, Saudi, are all CCUS ready, meaning when they need to switch it on, they can switch it on, right? But I would say still they would prefer the cost of CCUS to come down, some sort of mechanism. And there are some governments who are promoting, let's say, CCUS. We had some good examples in IRA in US, whereas others, it might be in the form of carbon market mechanism. But the sheer scale of CCUS in terms of reducing emissions is still critical. So that's always a watched out technology. And I would say there are more examples than green hydrogen of CCUS than in the recent years. Blue hydrogen, I think, is kicking off. If not pure forms of green hydrogen, there are a lot of blue hydrogen investments happening. Mainly because that's a good segmentation, to the transition. Rather than completely moving, let's say, the gas business to pure green, pure fired by pure renewable energy, the other colors such as blue is a good transition fuel before they get into the green. So that seems to be more realistic, especially in the developing markets. But again, the point is, irrespective of some of those, the pace is low, doesn't mean we have to stay away from it. The idea is you have to always keep them in your radar in terms of, let's say, your capital allocation or a long-term planning. And you have to wait and watch the market. And more importantly, you continue the stakeholder engagements, which is the governments, off-takers, and the customers. I heard in the last panel someone mentioning examples of, let's say, green steel here. There have been some good pilots announced in UAE. Our entity, Mazda themselves, are having some good examples and case studies to show. It's all about, all the stakeholders coming up and scaling it up so that you get the required number to get the net zero numbers.
You mentioned many of the factors we were discussing earlier, and especially when it comes maybe to infrastructure. And Amit, I've sat with investors, and whenever I raise the topic of investing in renewables and renewable projects, they mentioned exactly the same factors as we are discussing today. First of all, the regulatory framework. Number two, logistics and geopolitical tensions and geopolitics, and to what extent does it play a role? And third, investment in infrastructure as well. Um, from your background, to what extent do you think that making this shift to renewables require a quite different infrastructure, and to what extent do you think that governments are willing to make this transition and spend, I don't know, millions and billions to change the infrastructure to make this transition?
Yeah.
It was like the classical Indian music.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. I think probably
Okay.
so.
Is that
Go
better?
ahead.
Yeah. So I think, clearly the shift has to happen. I mean, that's a commitment that governments have already made, that they are going to try to meet the demand for net zero through alternative sources. The role of government to spur innovation, to spur opportunities for others to come in is there, and a lot of people are working in that space. I think one thing we have to really acknowledge is when you're thinking about all of the different technologies that we're looking at, for example, solar, wind, et cetera. The previous speaker made a point about Singapore and how land is such a critical resource. Now, when you start looking at the physical attributions of infrastructure, you need to recognize that certain parts, geography plays a big role there, risk plays a big role there. Understanding that not everywhere you can do the exact same thing. So how do you start to look at this variability on the ground? And from my point of view, which is really about the climate risk, how do you introduce that in a way that when you're investing in a solar farm, you're not losing it because you've not understood that that same location is prone to flooding tomorrow. We've seen examples already where investors have lost value because they have not understood that a certain location may not actually lend itself to would be interrupted over time. So I think part of what we are trying to do is when you're doing your investments, how are you starting to factor in disruptions because of issues of disasters, including climate change? So when you're projecting that I've got an investment in a solar farm, I've got a certain return for the next 30 years, how do you understand that in that next 30 years, you may actually lose productivity for a collective 6 months period because that is prone to cyclones or that is prone to flooding. So what we're trying to really do is introduce data that can help to say, okay, there are certain locations that may be better for certain kinds of infrastructure. Introduce, changing wind maps, for example, changing certain kinds of regulatory, wind maps is something that is done by a standard setting agency. Working with them to say, what are the standards that are now applicable for the future in those locations? So when you're investing in infrastructure, you've got a little bit more comfort in knowing that what I'm investing in will give me the returns that I'm expecting. So in that context, the role of government really becomes, and we are working with a number of governments now, how do you get that data out there? How do you start to introduce standards that are recognizing future risks? And how do you get people trained, building capacity of the decision makers to understand that when we are investing, in the long term, thinking about resilience is actually an opportunity as well. I mean, I think we've not talked about this in this forum yet, but if you can understand your long-term risk and then say, if I'm going to lose value because my asset will not be providing me services for 6 months, and that has a cost, if I can translate that into a dollar value and say, if I can make a slightly upfront improvement, I'll actually get that 6 months of service over time. These are discussions that are ongoing right now in the resilience space. This is a discussion that's starting to happen in the G20s. How do you actually understand risk from climate change, and how do you factor that into your cost benefit analysis today so that you're recognizing that the investment in infrastructure gives you the guaranteed return that you're expecting over its lifetime. Let me stop there.
Just one point to add, May, on what Ajay mentioned. I think practical example of what Ajay mentioned, we see as Taka. So we have a lot of exposure to the fixed income investors one emerging question these days from the investor community, the bond investors, and even the banks is actually on the climate risk. I mean, before the discussions and together with finance, the call were around, okay, how will you meet your targets and so forth and so on. But when we talk about our investment numbers, in case of TACA, 75 billion, we plan to investment by 2030. The bond investors are more keen to know, to Ajay's point, what exactly have you factored in some investments towards to meet the climate risks? Because for them, it's a serious thing, because if you're not factoring that in, they know it's going to be a huge opportunity, risk figures, reputational figures, which might be affecting the bottom line. Even in the financial reporting, as you see, there's more and more integration with sustainable reporting. The key thing which investors want to know, how do you estimate the impact of climate risks and what exactly the dollar value, whether it is in terms of adjusted NPV or the investment targets and so forth. And it's also about opportunities, by the way, because for us as a company, we are electrifying the grids, but they would also like to know, when you tell it's an opportunity for you, how much exactly is the dollar value. So risk is something which we see is getting much more focus, especially after the events we had in Dubai last year, where all the assets and infrastructure were exposed to varying extents. Investors are asking more and more these questions on quantifying the impact of climate risks.
Really interesting that maybe 10 or 15 years ago, climate risk was kind of an abstract notion. Today, it's more it has a financial impact. So
Yeah.
it's something that you can put a number for, which why public companies now are more wary of, because it can impact their bottom.
It's even in the board agenda these days. I mean, it's one of the agenda items you have in the sustainability committees of the board, looking at the impact of the risk and the numbers. So it's clearly there a number one priority, and it will only be accelerating going forward, as what Ajay was mentioning.
So, Hamad, you mentioned before innovation, AI, technology, and all of this big topic. So I would like to hear your story and your experience with Mubadala. To what extent is Mubadala able to integrate technology in infrastructure planning and infrastructure construction? I mean, how are you dealing with such technological advancement in your operations?
Thank you, May. I think innovation is the key word. I think we can all agree that achieving net zero in this world is an extremely challenging target. And we would need to back companies that are thinking of innovative ways to be able to decarbonize themselves and generally achieve decarbonization. And it's Mubadala's intention to be able to invest in companies that can wear that innovative hat while at the same time investing in projects that are bankable. I'll give a few examples from our portfolio. So one of our strategies is to invest in companies that are operating in hard-to-abate sectors, but they have a credible plan to achieve net zero. So one example is we've invested in a urea manufacturing facility in Australia. Now, urea is one of the hard-to-abate sectors. It has a very significant carbon footprint. So we've invested with this company called Perdaman Industries. However, Perdaman, at the time that they have started constructing this urea manufacturing plant, have already a credible plan to achieve net zero, because they've left a tremendous amount of space to put renewables so they can start powering that facility through renewables, and they have nearby gas fields which they can use for carbon capture. So for us, it's a very interesting story also from an investor's perspective. Over time, there will be carbon taxes and there'll be all kinds of things. And then if you're backing a urea manufacturing facility that is low cost, but at the same time has close to a zero carbon footprint, clearly becomes a very attractive investment value proposition. I'll give an example of another company that I think is truly innovative. It's not innovative in terms of technology, but how they think. So we're backing a company called PAG Renewables in Japan. Japan, like all countries, have aggressive renewable targets, but as you know, Japan has limited space. It's a mountainous region. So what this company is doing is it's going to disused farmland and disused golf courses. So Japan, believe it or not, has hundreds of disused golf courses, and nobody's using them. So this company is going in and they take that land and they repurpose it and start putting solar farms on it. And then they sort of lump up all of those, and then they sign sort of a long-term corporate power purchase agreement with somebody who wants 50 megawatts. So they're able to do all of that work. But it's a very innovative solution to go and find pieces of land that are not being used. Maybe the farmer doesn't have a good use for it. You give them rent, but then you're able to introduce renewables. And maybe a third example, which is I think relevant for India, and this is one of the most fundamental things we need for renewables, is how do you make renewables sort of not volatile? Because as we know, when the wind is not blowing, when the sun is not shining, you don't get renewables. And so the Indian market has introduced this concept of bidding for round-the-clock renewable solutions, which is you offer a hybrid renewable solution, which is a combination of wind, solar, and storage. So we've invested in Tata Renewables, which is one of the leaders in sort of providing round-the-clock solutions. It's much more complex. It needs a lot of AI and analytics to run. But I think that's another really innovative area that's helping to grow renewables.
Innovation and technology will play a great role in achieving net zero. So I still have 2.5 minutes before we wrap up. And I would like to ask the three of you one question. What would you like to see happening in the next decade when it comes to government policies and government spending to achieve net zero? And I'm going to start with you, Amit, please.
Not attention. There is a marginal cost. If you can invest in that now, you're actually avoiding long-term, So make sure that you're getting maximum efficiency of your investment by paying attention to resilience. To me, that's the critical point. I mean, and I'll just give you an example. We are already seeing that solar panels efficiency is lost because of increase in rise in temperature. We are already seeing the grid getting impacted because of flooding. So I think those are things that do have an aggregated impact on infrastructure investment. So just by paying a little bit more attention, we can be more efficient with our investments.
I mean, I can still hope, but I would expect for a regulation where they price ESG financially into the investment decision making. So governments and regulators telling, yeah, this is how much you have to factor into the pricing. But of course, before they do that, they have to also commit how they will be, injecting some cash to the system so that the private sector is not affected. So I would like to see that in action, because at the moment, incorporating the cost of ESG is more of a voluntary decision or a practice majority still. Yeah.
I think Fazal's already hit on the key points. To accelerate our journey towards net zero, you talked about grids and the fact that we still don't have the right transmission networks to be able to connect all the renewable capacity that's coming online with the people. And I think, Fazal, you also touched on the fact that carbon capture and hydrogen, which are key parts of the story, are still nascent. The costs are too high, the regulatory framework is not there. But I think even more basic, I think I was starting with the example of India, which provides bankable power purchase agreements. And there's still a number of very large emerging Asian economies that are not providing that basic, robust regulatory framework to encourage international investment.
For me, I think what is really going to be game-changing for this will be investors coming in to finance these kind of projects more. I mean, we keep saying that governments should do more and banks should do more when it comes to financing, but I think that investors as well need to pay attention to these projects, renewable projects, and not be so greedy about financing such projects when it comes to the targeted return on investments. With this, we come to the end of this session. Thank you so much for joining us, Amit, Fazil, and Hamad, and thank you so much for being with us today. Of course, we promise you more interesting sessions during the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, May. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Amit. How do we get Amit into this?
He can Photoshop Amit then.